Hello, hello, everybody. We're here to talk about WikiTree Challenge number 23 for Mark Cuban. And with me is, the other way, we have Thomas. We have Thomas, who was the captain of the week and also one of the researchers. Down below me is Lewis, and he is an expert on Jewish genealogy and also one of our researchers. And Elaine as well is very specialized with the Jewish research that we definitely needed this week. And it's been a great week. So, Thomas, how do you think everything went?
Well, I mean, as per the usual, we had some last-minute discoveries that we were not fully expecting, and had some expansion on lines that we. Well, I mean, Lewis will talk more to that. He was the one who brought about the major surprise at the end there, which we're all
Yeah.
very, very pleased about. But no, I mean, for the most part, there were a few lines that had us stuck the entire week, which was a source of annoyance. But there were other ones where we managed to get quite a lot done, and we did expand a lot horizontally as we expected to at the beginning of the week, which is really the best we can hope for some of these lines. So overall, I say the week went pretty well.
Yeah, I think it did too. Watching the collaboration between everybody is always exciting and fun. And, just watching people work together and looking at things like the name variations or helping each other translate the tombstones, looking for the records on the Jewish Gen site, just really a lot of fun. And I do have some slides to show tonight, but I think unlike we already did a wrap up in Zoom, of course, where we went over the points and who won and everything else. And tonight, I'd really rather talk about, what we specifically found, as well as, what you guys thought the challenges were with those people and those records and locations. So I'm going to go ahead and put this up here. And, of course, the WikiTree Challenge has been going for all of 2022. And, we're covering Shark Tank TV personality and the Dallas Mavericks team owner, basically just a great entrepreneur, Mark Cuban. And it's really just been a lot of fun. Now, the first ancestor we're going to look at, and we're trying to look at the new ancestors here. I know he does know quite a bit about some of his ancestry as well as his brother, but we dove a little deeper, and you guys found out more than what they had available. So this is going to be Mira Kavinsky, and this is one of Mark's third great grandfathers. And so to start here, we're going to be on his father's side, Norton Chabinsky Cuban. On to his father, Moish Moses Cuban. To his father, Nessel. And then to his father, Yos Hayim or Yosef Kabinsky. And then we finally make it out to Mir. So you guys really made it a long way out on that line. And he may have been born somewhere around 1808. We're thinking in Malin and Kiev, which was under the Russian Empire at the time. We do know that he later resided there with his wife. And is that Sisa, Mir's wife?
Stysia, I believe.
Sisia. They had at least one child, a daughter. And then this is one of the records, of course, Lewis down there was able to find from us. And it was really, we were excited. It was fun to see how excited everybody was. And then Lewis led up to it. So he's like, oh, I have this great, great news for you guys and a great surprise. And we're all sitting on the edge of our seats, and then he didn't tell us right away. And then when he did, we were just really super excited about it. Everybody was. And he had gotten in touch with another expert who is in the midst of a project scanning up records that aren't available to anybody else. And his name is Boris Mikalski. And this record, this is a piece of the 1850 census there in Malin, where we figure he lived. And it was reproduced with Boris's permission. It's from an entire group, once again, that he's with that are scanning up these Jewish records from the state archives. And, he talked about the history of the Kavinsky family from Malin and said they can be traced back to the 1750s and that only one family with that surname lived there. So there, Lewis, do you want to tell us a little bit about the possibilities for the father?
Well, to be honest, I don't know. My researcher, what I did was when I noticed that the ancestor was from the town of Malin, I looked up where Malin was, and it's right in the district which my researcher researches. So I sent him a little email and asked him at the beginning of the week if by any chance he had records for a Kavinsky in Malin. And a few days later, he wrote back and he said he has quite a bit. So he supplied me with one record of Kavinsky as a teaser. And he said that he told me about the family. I think I wrote most of the notes on the profile. I am very poor at remembering these things. Like any genealogist, I have thousands of people in my genealogy and I can't keep them straight. So we have the notes, and I know my researcher has quite a few more records for this family and can piece a bit more of the family together. So that's and he'll make that available to Mark Cuban if Mark Cuban wants to find out.
Yep. So I know we'd all be more than a little bit excited if he sees this and he's able to reach out and get even more information. And you know how wonderful that there is this name that is so unique in that area, right? You know that these are the only possibilities. If they are there in that town, they are related. Now, from what I saw in the notes, it was a Jos Volko who was one of the possibilities for the father, and he was born about 1819, but he was a little bit old to be Mira's father, and he already had 3 children. But his nephew, who was Jos Chaim, was born in 1834 and said he was more likely to be the father. So even though, you know, we don't have the additional records yet or anything else from Boris, you know, that gave really good clues on where the next person can take off with this research.
May I make
And I
one
found
note? If you go back to the record again, can you go back, Mindy? Just take a look at that record and take a look at that handwriting. Now, this is what you get. This is like bad English handwriting in a different language. And you have to interpret the words as to what they mean. And you're going through books and books and books of this. This is not something that the normal North American researcher can do on their own. The amazing thing is that these records have just started becoming digitized in the last few years. And people like Boris are starting to go through them and find names for people and index them and make them available. I have personally really gained on my own genealogy from researchers like Boris in the various areas of my family, which I would never have been able to do on my own. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, definitely outstanding and you know worth mentioning. And I know there was another record. Elaine and I had done the same thing. We were going back and forth, and you know it didn't fit with what she was translating it as. It didn't look like what it was supposed to be, but it was just the lettering, like you said. It's not like it's typed out or you know even necessarily neatly printed when you get to those records. So, but they are really fun to find. And then just for a little bit of history on Malin here, and that's Malin Station showing there. But it is currently in Ukraine, and it's known now for its paper factory. It has an important railroad running through the city, as well as a major highway. The first record of Jewish people in that city was in 1874. And I noticed in several places that they said, you know, although 1784 seems to be the consensus because that's the first official, I guess, document, that a lot of the historians believe there were Jewish people there long before that time. Now, in 1784, there were 28, and the number jumped to 1,064 by 1847, you know, which would have been during that time that Mira was there. So just a huge influx. And, I know you guys know more on it than I do. The Jewish history is not in my realm of experience, but I know in a lot of the reading that I've done, they talk about how, they were constantly throughout history pushed out of areas. So you'd see these big changes in numbers like that, where it was just a few and then a lot and then back to a few. And really interesting how they'd migrate back to those same areas. And by the late 19th century, the records show that they had a synagogue, 2 prayer houses, and a Jewish hospital there. So we also know that a Jew named Yaakov Rabinovich and his brother Aaron own a furniture factory, some dairy farms, and a dairy plant. So I mean, it was a well-developed, uh, although not huge, community. And then, of course, as with many of the Jewish communities throughout the region, many of them fled or were killed during the Holocaust. But after World War II, some of the families returned once again, and some of the surnames like Kavinsky remained in that area. Now, his
Yeah,
wife,
still in 1950 or 60, they're there.
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, we got an address directory that has the Kavinsky name in 1950, 1960. So that's cool.
Mhm.
that's awesome.
So,
Didn't find out too much about his wife, Stysia. So we know she was born in 1808, possibly there also in Malin, where she later lived. That her father was Zalik, with no documented surname. And when was it? Would you say like mid 19th century that the Jewish people were required to have a surname, but before that they didn't necessarily have one?
It would be around the early 19th century. I don't know the exact date, maybe Lewis does, but I'd say somewhere around like 1805, 1810, something like that.
That's about right, in that area of Ukraine.
Mhm. And speaking of, actually, I want to mention with regards to the Kavinsky name, because we're about to go into this Kostinski family and everything. We do have, thanks to Alexander Bider, the great dictionary of Jewish surnames from the Russian Empire, which actually tells us the origin of the Kavinsky surname, which suggests that it is probably related to the town of Chabno, which is where the Kostinskis are recorded in one of the records that we pulled up. But we did not find the Kavinskis there yet. So
Yes.
they may have originally traced their line from there, even if we don't have records.
Thomas and I were chatting before the live cast, and he was saying what a great resource that turned out to be. Like he knew it'd be good, but then he got it, and he just keeps using it. So
Yeah,
that's
when we
pretty
had
amazing.
Scott Turo's week a few months ago, I checked this out from the local library, and I've had it pretty much permanently checked out ever since. I keep renewing it.
Well, it's always good to see that, we can circle back to some of these Jewish families. And, especially on WikiTree, because I don't think a lot of them have the presence that they should. And that's
Mhm.
been growing. And it's really fun and exciting to see the interest in these families and in honoring these ancestors. And so next we do go into the Kostinskis. And this again is a third great grandfather and Balak. And for that, we go through his father Norton again, still on the dad's side of the tree, back through Moish, onto his mother Leah, then to her father Mordek, and then finally to Balak. And he was born about 1815, so just a little bit later than what the last one was. He may have been born in Kobno, where his son Mordek was born. I can't say the name of that town, Poliskoye, Ukraine. His wife was
they changed
Sosia,
it.
daughter of Burko. I may have copied it then before you fixed it. I know we were both in their editing profiles the last couple of days. And we do have a notation too from one of the researchers that his grandson, Moshe Pollock, probably was named for him, which indicated that he likely died before Moshe was born in 1882. And I noticed that it wasn't always easy to necessarily get a death record for these. So do you guys think that it's maybe just because the tombstones aren't all documented yet? Or why do you think it's so difficult on some
They're
of the lines?
destroyed.
Okay.
I don't know about the death records, but I know there are a ton of tombstones that were destroyed. anywhere between 1900 and 1945, tons of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's different
that
in
would make
different
sense.
areas, but yeah, I don't know a thing about the paper death records though.
The birth, marriage, death records are hit and miss. It depends on which particular town. Some of them, and my researcher would know better than me, but they generally start around 1850, 1860 at the best.
That's what I'm saying too.
And before that, you just
Yeah.
have these revision lists, which are like censuses, which help you put the families together previous to that.
I'm
Yeah, that can be
curious,
really valuable.
Louis, if you know how far back the revision lists on average go in this region of Ukraine offhand, because
Some go to the early 1800s, like 1815. I believe there's also a revision list 1780 or so that is available in some areas, but again, it's hit and miss.
yeah, absolutely. Now I know that with birth, marriage, death, at least in my experience, the best bet in being able to find them, just in general, but especially digitized, is again Lithuanian records, which we'll get to in a little bit, because they have an excellent indexing project going on.
Yeah, and that, that's one of the problems too, when you wind up with these families where, we see that a lot of his family members were in Malin, they were in Plungay, they were in Kodno. If they're staying in these tight little areas and they stay there for generations, somebody comes in and something happens and records are wiped out, then you're losing records for generations of that family, not just the families that lived there at that time. Very, very hard for the researchers. And here once again was Boris that Lewis had contacted, and notes that he had taken about from scanning documents in the area. And he had been able to provide a couple of documents, but also, these clues that talked about the different families who could have possibly been the parents. Some of the names were assessed. And like they were talking about, they were not able to find Leia. Socia, I know there were a couple of things, people talking about that as far as with her name, and that was the Susil one, correct? And yeah, and it's pretty much been determined that most likely was just an alternate given name, not
Mhm.
her actual surname.
Which
So
means we should probably get someone in there to
interesting,
change
good
the,
stuff.
the last name at birth.
Yeah. And it just goes to show too how valuable and important these research notes are. And I've had people come to me and say, oh well, we fixed this problem and we found out what her surname was. Can we just delete all those notes? Please don't, because I like other people to be able to come in and go, oh, this is why they didn't think this was her father, because otherwise sometimes people are going to come back and go, oh, this record makes sense, I'm going to add it, because they don't have those notes there that explains, why that record would not work. So I always leave the research notes there, and we like, helping out other researchers and not making them do something twice that's already been done. So now here is one of the areas that of course was occupied back at that time. More background information on Kovno. It was part of the Russian Empire once again, and it was in the Radomysl governorate. In the 1990s, it was resettled after Chernobyl, of course, the huge nuclear disaster happened, and there was a lot of radioactive pollution, and so it's actually no longer registered as a place of habitation, and the visits are only allowed by special permission. But Elaine, didn't you tell me this? They actually like picked the town up and moved it, I mean, as far as the townspeople?
I think so. I didn't really understand the whole story, but that there weren't many people left anyway. But yeah, they moved west by about 50 miles or so, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I didn't know the Chernobyl exclusion zone was so big. Haha, I did that in about 15 minutes. If you go to that website at the teeny tiny at the bottom, I should have made it bigger, then you can see the actual image, but we didn't get, permission
I
for
can put it
so I
in the
didn't do that.
chat. See.
But what I liked about that one was it wasn't a flat roof. Pretty much all the other wooden synagogues you see have a kind of ordinary looking roof. Now, do you have the next slide, Mindy? Is it the really big one, the public domain
I
image
don't.
that's in Poland?
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well, anyway. Yeah, go to the website. It looks even worse on the computer than it does in real life. I think I'll try that one again. But he may have had relatives who actually went there.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And like Elaine was pointing out earlier, it's kind of like how they put false fronts on some buildings because it really allows them to make the building appear larger than what it is, with the big peaks up there that aren't actually like a functional part of the building, but
Yeah,
really,
I think a lot of
really nice.
I think a lot of the tall peak synagogues actually have space up there, but this is one that was just like one of those old Western towns, like those ghost towns where you put the false front in front. I think that's what that was. It's all really neat wood paneling and stuff. Okay, let's move on.
Jesus, I want to quit looking at it now.
Now that I look at it, oh dear.
And if you look at the other buildings that they have, though, too, they have that same like style right there in that particular location. Now, Burko was one of the ones that, of course, we had no surname for, and that goes back to what we've already talked about. He just may not have had a surname, and and usually they were like Burko, son of Lee, as far as what their name was. That was their name. They didn't say, oh, John Smith. They always added that as part of their name, who the father was, and we're still on his father's side of the tree. Going to Morris once again. Over to Leah, over to her mother, Socia Pessel, and then Burko. And we didn't have a whole lot of information on him except for, just what we were finding about Mullen for the actual area. He was born about 1820 in Mullen, and he was mentioned in his daughter Socia's records, but I don't believe that anybody found anything directly with Burko. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
I think he kind of remained a mystery, and also there was the whole thing about some of these other lines were so complicated and complex that people were focusing on them and just trying to make sure they had everything straightened out. Now,
I believe Boris may have records about Burko, because
that would be great.
And actually the whole family going back there, but the only record he supplied just gave Burko's name. So we didn't have a record for WikiTree to supply any more information.
So
Brian Cuban and Mark Cuban need to call him or message him.
They need to get a hold of him. Once again, he is going to be the person to contact now to go further on these lines, because of course the challenge only lasted for a week. So even though, some of us kind of dally in there and we play a little bit on the profiles afterwards, our research is for one solid week to see what we come up with. So there's always more that can be discovered, no matter how difficult the ancestry is. So, definitely you're going to want to get a hold of Boris and find out what else he's got for you. Now, here again, they're talking about Mullen and how in 1793, when Poland was divided for the second time, that's when Mullen became part of Russia. Now, in 1797, the government authorities formally incorporated it into the Radomyshl district of the Kiev governorate. So the 19th century saw a lot of Jewish families migrating through this area.
And those years, 1793, is very important because I think it's actually a year after 1794 that Russia establishes the Pale of Settlement, which is that mass migration into that region, which is why all of these families end up there in the first place. A lot of them, at least.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the solid cutoff here that I saw everywhere was the 1794, as far as them establishing that the Jewish families were, in fact, relocated into that area. Now, here we found several people, which was fun, really fun to watch people researchers take off with this and the Ziv line. And so we're going to start out with another third great grandfather this time. It will be Liba Ziv. And so this time we're going to move over to Mark's mother's side of the tree, go through her mother, Sarah Frantel Feldman, to her mother, Sivia Ziv Grudes, then to her father, Uzel Ziv, and finally to his father, Liba Ziv. And, as you see, we don't have the wives for Uzel or Liba. This is really common with the research during this time, is once again, people were named as so-and-so and then son or daughter of, with the father's name. So, that combined with the fact that there are so many records that are either lost or not scanned yet. And in the middle of projects like what Boris is doing, that may be the only clue we have is those particular records. And so we can follow the paternal line, but we don't necessarily always get the wife. Now, here is one of those locations that, I mentioned, and Liba was born about 1799 and most likely in Plungay. He had two known sons. So he had Uzel born in 1820 and Zelman in 1824. Now, he died 3 years later, though, and he was only about 28 years old. So likely his death was in Plungay, but it was one of those death records that we definitely were not able to find. And Liba Ziv, how that is there, was the spelling in the earliest record, which was one of those revision lists in 1834. So that's the spelling that's being used. But there were some records where his first name was spelled as Leib, so Leyb. And then here you can see him listed as son of Eliash and Merke. And this is one of those records that, Thomas was saying is more like a census, and it really is. You can see the household composition. This shows that there's 2 grandchildren in the home. And of course, they're the sons that I had just talked about, Uzel and Zelman. And so this was the record where we learned that Liba died in 1827. So just after 3 years after Zelman was born. So his kids were quite little. Now, any of you, I know that, that it was common to marry within faith, not necessarily taking into account relationships, but, how common was it for somebody with small children like that, a widower, to remarry right away? Is it just like in other locations where they marry quickly so they have a wife to take care of the children? Or
Yeah, generally, men did not go without wives for very long. And in fact, quite often, a man would marry his wife's sister if his wife passes away.
Yes. Which is something that we saw on one of the other branches of the family. I'm not sure if that's in the interesting finds or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it made
I don't
it
know
or
if
not.
it is on the slide. And that was more recent too. Like because they remarried, they married
That
in
would
the
be,
US,
I think,
right?
1920s. Yeah,
Yeah.
1923 was the remarriage.
Yeah, and I noticed some, conversations about that as far as, were they allowed to do that? Were there any restrictions on doing that? But fairly common. And, and I know in some other locations too, even in the United States, there were areas where that was fairly common. And if you were widowed, then you went to the sibling, you went to the brother-in-law, and if the woman was to have him take care of it, or you married a sister. So now Zelman's daughter, Sylvia, was born in 1867 in Darbonai, and her name in Hebrew on her cemetery stone is Sivia, daughter of Yosef. She first married Samuel Frankel and had 2 daughters. Now, Samuel died in 1915, and Sylvia, I was surprised, didn't remarry until 1927. And so, another 12 years later. And by that time, of course, she'd migrated to the United States. She was the first generation American for that line, and she was living in Trenton, New Jersey. So she married Mordecai Grunes, who was also born in the Russian Empire and also widowed. And she lived to be about 75 years old, dying in Paterson, New Jersey. Now, do we know why this particular family wound up in that location, or?
Well, I remember the first passenger listing I came across did list I don't remember if it was a cousin or an uncle or something like that. I'm going to try to pull that up now. But there was mentioned another relative, I believe, which is usually the case.
Yes, it
Yeah.
In New
was Butler,
Jersey.
Hessel, I believe.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh no, Hessel was left back in the old country.
Okay.
It's the other way. Yeah.
I think that's always fun, though, when you first start researching the ones that migrated and you're like, oh, they're in the household of this person. And it isn't until you get further back that you realize, oh, that was like the uncle, or, the dad's brother, or, you really start seeing the relationships and the family dynamics.
Mhm.
And here, Plungate once again was one of the locations that several of the families were in, and they stayed there for a while. It is a city in modern day Lithuania. Of course, for our needs, we named the locations on WikiTree what they were historically at the time. And so a lot of the places just say Russian Empire, but now would be Lithuania. And it's thought that it was inhabited actually as early as the 5th century. So it remained what they call an ordinary settlement until the 16th century. And that's when it really started to explode and grow quickly. So about 6 years before Lee was born, it was granted rights by the Holy Roman Emperor. And during Lee's lifespan, it belonged to Platon Zubov of the Russian Empire. The palace viewed above wasn't built until 1879. So after his death and during his son Uzel's lifetime. But, he was there to see the population really expand.
It's about
And
50
then,
miles from the ocean.
and then here, as we see in a lot of the research, and it's always so heartbreaking to go through this Jewish research because there's always some point in time, historically that they had tragedy. But in 1941, about 1,800 Jews in the Plunge district were murdered and buried there. So some of them had been kept in the synagogue for like 2 weeks with no food, unsanitary conditions. They made them walk 5 kilometers, which would be about 3 miles. And once they were there, they were told to dig this massive pit, which of course was a mass gravesite. So they had to actually dig the pit that they were buried in. And the very last surviving Plungate Jew, which was Yakov Bunka, who was awarded orders and medals for battle merits. And he lost his grandparents, his father, his youngest sister, and his brother during the war. But he still devoted his life later to the remembrance of everyone there that was killed. And so he founded the Kostinski Memorial with a few friends. And they created these memorial items from 1986 to 1989, further marking the events and those that they lost. So if you look there on the left, there's a lot of the wood features like that were carved out. The oak ones weren't added until later, but there's also some earlier wood features carved out along with the wall that you see that has the names. Also on the zip line was Elias Zib. So here we're still on the mother's side. To her mother, Sarah. To her mother, Sivia. To her father, Uzel. To her father, Leva Zib. And finally to his father, Elias. Now, here was one of the ancestors that was born about 1777 and most likely in Plungay. So he married Marque and they had at least 3 children, We know he had Liba, born in 1799, Noson, born in 1805, and then their daughter Minda, born in 1818. And this Kovno Gubernia is one of the biggest administrative districts in Imperial Russia's province, Lithuania. So the Jewish community in Plungay was among the first in Lithuania. And they say in 1847, the Jewish community there had a population of almost 2,200 people. And then here again, it was fun, that researchers were able to find specific records and documents instead of just indexes. And, here we see that Elias was taxed in 1846. So we do know that he was residing there still, and he was listed as well-to-do in the tax record. Now, 2 years later, though, he was listed as unable to pay the tax with one adult male in the family, and then they marked and notated that Elias had died in 1848. This is him with his wife, Mirka, and children, Liba, Nosan, and Minda. And at least 2 of the children predeceased him by more than 20 years. So Minda, I think, is the only one we did not have a death date for, and we're unsure of when she died. And this is just a rendering of one of the forts. There were several of them that were built, Fort 3, Fort 9, and Fort 10. And I think for these ancestors, they were actually by Fort 9. And, when the Jews did arrive in Lithuania, and a lot of them settled in Trakai and Brisk, and later came to Kovno as merchants, a lot more Jewish families came into those areas and settled there permanently. And here again was, tales of how they were periodically just exiled by the town's leaders, and they were, often forced to leave Kovno. And so, luckily they didn't have to go that far, and they would just turn around and wait for a little bit, and they'd move back. So, they'd slowly trickle back into this area, and it would just start the whole cycle over again. And, it says in the history that during almost every new ruler, they were once again expelled. So, later than what some of these relatives were that we just recently looked at the end of the 19th century, so it'd still be 1800s, the city of Kaunas was fortified. And by 1890, it was encircled by 8 forts and 9 gun batteries. The construction of the 9th fort began in 1902 and was actually completed on the eve of the First World War. So, just really interesting to be able to look at these buildings. And, if you look at a clearer picture, they're not in great shape now, but it really gives you an idea of how they changed the landscaping of those towns. Now we've gone further out to Israel, and this is Mark's 5th great-grandfather. So you guys stretched way out there for this one. One of the oldest ancestors that was found. And here we're still on his mother's side, to her mother Sarah, her mother Sivia, her father Uzel, his father Liba, then his father Elijah, and then finally to Israel. And once again, the oldest ancestor that we found, I believe. And if not, he was one of them. He was born about 1750 in Plungay, which we, learned a lot about now that we've been researching into the area. He was listed as the father of Elias in the 1834 revision list. And it's not known where he was born, but his descendants were living in Plungay in 1834. So it is possible that he was born there. Once again, we don't have the availability that some countries would or some locations would for the birth records and whatnot. So we're not really sure. And here they were talking in the history of this town, this community belonged to, and was one that where many of the Jewish people were relocated to the Pale. But
Yeah.
I think, don't you think, Thomas, that further research could probably be done on this line as well to find out at least, if he had other children and whatnot?
It's hard to say what research could be done, I guess is the way to put it, because there is always the possibility of records being able to be found, but it's not necessarily likely because, it's not an issue with regards to birth records, at least. It's not as much of an issue that records were destroyed as they were in other locations, but for this time period that, they were lost or even not kept in the same format that we would hope for. And so it's really difficult to say whether or not we could find them. And then also there's all that migration and everything that's going on. That's the establishment of the Pales right after 40 years after he was born. And so there's a lot of movement that isn't going to be accounted for no matter how hard we look. So it really, maybe it could be traced further. Who knows?
Yeah. And, so what are the options though for researchers? I mean, if it's before that 1834 revision list, what options do you have for trying to track down the families?
Well, I say, there's all sorts of clues that can be picked up based off of context. One thing that can always be done is looking into, for instance, the origin of the surname that can point to specific meanings. If you find two people in the same town who have the same surname, chances are they're related. It's just a question of how.
Yeah.
And, we're able to piece together some of that thanks to the records that were pulled up on Mark's father's side. But, with other sides, it's going to be more difficult. So, there's all sorts of different things. But looking at specific lines of descent, the difficulty of it is that, we have these tightly knit communities and these communities where there's a lot of, endogamy, where, like genetic testing and things like that we might rely upon for solving these sorts of mysteries in other families aren't going to be as helpful, especially this far back. But, there's just all these overlapping lines that it becomes very complicated.
Lots of challenge for our researchers out there. And, this is just a quick look at where the ancestors came from, the same cluster of locations. And there was Darbini, which was much further west than the others, but otherwise they were fairly clumped together, except, of course, once they migrated to the family there in the United States.
Mhm.
Did we get your map in here, Elaine?
Oh, no, it's not. Maybe you can go to Discord and share screen at the end or something.
Yeah.
I like my little map.
I was really excited
I just
about
wrote a
that.
few. It was all I did last minute. Oh, hey, nifty. It got kind of busy once I added so many names, but you could see at the top left, there's Darbini, and bottom right is, so Dnipro, or however you say that was a Katarina Slav. Like they changed the name at some point. So if you look at our WikiTree records, it's all going to say Katarina Slav. But yeah, the Feldman family is and the Alpern family too is at the tippy edge of what's now the border of Romania and Ukraine. But at the time that they were born, it was Romania. Yeah.
And it's
So
really
yeah,
fun
it's
to
a
see
big
this.
area.
Yeah. And Elaine, you do a great job at this. I know you've done this for some of our other families, and done the name overlays like this onto the maps, but it really gives you a good idea of, how far apart they were or were not from each other. And we had so many interesting finds this time. It's always hard to pick interesting finds, and what I would say is, since we're focusing more on talking about the research and, the process tonight, is if you really want to see all of the interesting finds, definitely go to wikitree.com and look in the G2G, which is our genealogist to genealogist forum, and look at the highlights for Mark Cuban. We had 21, I believe, distinct unique finds. For which were just interesting things that happened to either the direct ancestors or the cousins, and take a look at the rest of what we found. But I did bring a few of them in here, and this one was interesting. It was not in a good way, but Mark's second great grandfather, Moshe Frankel, was an innkeeper there in Darbonai, and he was in a list of residents who suffered from fire in October of 1882, and that actually resulted in 40 buildings being burnt down. So there were 84 records of individuals who suffered in that fire, and just like anywhere else, sometimes it takes a tragedy to, you know, cause a record to reflect that somebody was there where you might not see their name otherwise, but just really sad that that fire was so severe. And here is the relationship. So this is a relationship actually by blood. Now, we're all related though, really by blood or marriage. And you think about your modern day families and, the people you interact with and you talk to and you meet with. And, I know that I have cousins that are very important to me and, they kind of affect also your view of the world sometimes. And so cousins are important to find also. Now, this was another one, and this was his great grandmother's sister in law. So we have Bella Alpern, who had gone to visit her parents in Novoselic in the Russian Empire in the summer of 1914. Now, of course, 2 days after she arrived, World War I started. So she was forced to spend the next 21 months there. And, she was fearful of traveling across the Atlantic during the time when the German U-boats were sinking ships. So we talked about this a little bit in our wrap up and just how tragic that would be and how awful to be separated, from her family for so long. And, here is how WikiTree will display the connection. It's really great to see how you're connected to people. And this one is a relation by marriage. So where one of them is yellow and then it goes to the green color, that's where the connection is no longer by blood. It was by marriage just for that very last step. This one we had was Mark's grandmother's, her second husband, Mordecai, so Max Grunis. And the direct ancestor, of course, was the first husband, but this was Mordecai. And he'd only been in the country for 2 years when he was assaulted in 1905 by young men throwing wet paper balls at his head. And, I know kids are kids, but really that he must not have felt very welcome at that time. And then years later in 1946, someone sneaked into his house. They stole his wallet containing $30. And really the thing that was more valuable was they stole 10 pounds of sugar. So, at that time it was a really valuable commodity because of the post-war rationing of sugar was still in effect. And that was better than gold there for a bit. And here we can see that connection. And once again, it's by blood connection until we get to that last step, and it's by marriage. Now on WikiTree, we're all cousins by blood or marriage. So right now there are 27,875,864 cousins on WikiTree, alive or not. So those are our connected people. And then here are a few of the notable cousins. And, we have fun finding this. Now, during the challenge, we work out to 7 degrees. So we'll go up, that's quite a ways, 7 steps out from our primary people. But sometimes you do find some really interesting cousins. So we have here, Mark is related to Abraham Goodman Mann. Now, he's notable as an award-winning screenwriter with his most notable works being Judgment at Nuremberg, which was initially a television drama. He also created the series Kojak, starring Telly Savalas. Boy, flashbacks to the past. Some of us will be aged ourselves. Yes, we remember that. The second one is related by marriage to William Robert Schilgold. Now, he was a fairly famous artist, first working in Pittsburgh area before moving to Hollywood, where he painted movie stars, including Ronald Colman. And then the third one, related by marriage to Russell Ross, he received many awards and honors. And he's known for his work with arteriosclerosis theories, which, resulted in some profound improvement with vascular biology. And just give a quick thank you again at the end here. There's Thomas, our captain, the challenge captain, and then Celia Marsh. She was our MVP, so our most valuable participant. We don't do this for the points, but the points are a fun way to keep track of, how you're doing and get a little healthy competition going. And then Donna Bowman had the most bounty points, which are awarded for special discoveries. And then just a thank you again to Boris, who provided some really immeasurable assistance during the challenge. We couldn't do it without everybody that participated, though. So, a big thank you to all of the rest of our researchers. So, now that we're done with that, do you guys have any tips for others trying to research ancestors from these locations?
Yeah, one thing that was mentioned was the different spellings of the names. Have to remember that the original spelling was in Russian or in Yiddish, and all the records are either in Russian, Yiddish, or Hebrew. And so these anglicized names are simply the transliteration that whoever was indexing the record decided to spell the name. So the English spelling really doesn't matter.
Which is
So, do you know why? It's too bad that Jewish Gen doesn't allow searches by Hebrew or Yiddish. Like, you can do it in Russian, but as far as I can tell, you can't do it in Hebrew or Yiddish. But I guess if so many of the indexes are only written out in the Romanized letter, and the researchers, the indexers, aren't putting it in all the different languages that they saw it, maybe that's why. Maybe it's left to right thing. I mean, right to left. I don't know.
I believe almost all the Jewish Gen indexes are in English.
Yeah.
So, golly, why can't they just put both on, I wonder?
Well, they do have the Soundex, because the main thing is you're just trying to catch the sound of the name anyway.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Jewish Gen is, I believe, based in New York. It's primarily catering to American genealogists, which is understandable. We can't expect every genealogist to have a grasp of all the different languages involved in this research, but it would be very useful if they offered it in all of the relevant languages. Personally, I mean, that's part of the reason why I do my best to record all the information I find in the original language as accurately as possible, because you aren't going to get those spelling variations in the Yiddish. Every record is going to have the same thing unless it's a different form of the name. It's makes life a lot easier, all things considered. But
yeah, it's just too bad you can't search using those names like on Jewish Gen or whatever. Maybe someday.
Yeah, something. There's always room for improvement.
Maybe they're here taking notes.
Be nice. Yeah, no, it's true of Jewish.
So if you're listening,
everywhere.
The other fun we had all
I
week.
do think their Soundex is pretty good, though.
What was that, Lewis?
Go ahead, Lewis.
The other fun we all had this week were Jewish headstones.
Yes.
And there were a lot of different headstones posted for interpretation. And it's through the headstones we found many of the connections and verified parent-child or father-child, or that a person might have been a cousin, etc. And that was really one of the most interesting parts to me of the week.
Yeah, that's one of the really, I think, unique aspects of Jewish research in general, is that, occasionally you'll find gravestones for other groups of people where it will mention other relatives' names or towns or things like that, but it's not as widespread anywhere else. Here we can get some incredibly, sometimes it's more than even just the parents' names. Sometimes it'll list both parents. Sometimes it'll list towns. Sometimes it'll list, specific lineage. It's an incredibly useful resource that isn't always Well, it's not available to us in other areas of research, and it's really quite wonderful.
And it seems like the tombstones that were looked at for this challenge were actually nicely legible. So, where, I know some of our researchers needed assistance in translating, which is why we have live Discord. You can go in and go, hey, can somebody tell me what this tombstone says? But, but the stones themselves were in good shape.
Now, speaking of legibility, I have lost count of the number of times I have had to go on Find a Grave and request a new photo of a grave because a person who took a photo did not know that that is the thing they should be focusing on. It annoys me to no end every time I have to do that.
Yeah, clear photos are worth their weight in gold.
Yes, they are. Yeah, I've done a lot of tombstone photographs, and I'm really careful about not putting shadows or, taking a second picture if another angle will show something better. But I have seen people that take like a picture of 6 stones and then they just clip each stone out of it so that they're not taking as many pictures, and you just don't get the clarity when you do that. You
Yeah.
need, especially what you guys are dealing with doing these translations, you need every nuance of the letters. You can't, have somebody that stood off to the side of it and kind of took a side shot at that tombstone. It's just a lot harder to read.
Yeah.
One really nifty thing I found just yesterday was stevemorse.com or .org, I forget, who does the census matching. There's also a Russian print and cursive feature.
Yes.
And so I know a few letters, but not a whole lot. So I was able to use that to some degree, especially with shorter words. But yeah, and you can click different fonts like bold and italic and whatever, and it'll tell you what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah, it was pretty exciting.
I don't know what Steve Morse is up to these days in general, but he really is a giant in terms of this area of research. Him and Bider, because the sound decks, the whole program that exists in order to match those different variations of the surname was developed by Steve Morse in conjunction with Alexander Bider, and it's just an incredible resource that we use constantly.
Well, I think unless we have something else, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. We're hitting our hour mark. I want to thank you guys for joining us. Thomas, thank you for captaining this week. And Lewis and Lane, it is such a pleasure when you jump in and you join us on a challenge. So we did especially need your presence this week, though, so that we had a really nice selection of Jewish experts. And you guys watch, we've only got one more challenge left for the year. And Mark, if you're watching this right now, get a hold of Boris. And if you have any questions, get a hold of us and we'll help you get a hold of Boris. And so thank you, WikiTreeers, and we'll see you at the next one.